Dr. Michael Driscoll is teaching faculty at the Institute for Governance and Civics at Florida State University, where he teaches courses on the American founding, foreign policy, and political thought. Dr. Driscoll received his Ph.D. from the Van Andel Graduate School of Statesmanship, where he earned honors for his dissertation on John Locke's political thought. His current research project focused on John Locke's views on human happiness, domestic policy, and international relations. His research also examines American citizenship, civic education, 20th century liberalism, and the relationship between social compact theory and American foreign policy.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Professor Wheatland for the invitation to be part of this panel, and to New College for providing us with the opportunity to reflect upon the American founding and the foundations for an exceptional republic. It's a real treat for me to be able to speak about Locke, the founder's favorite philosopher, and his influence on the founding. Locke's name is frequently invoked during the late colonial and revolutionary periods to justify Americans' claims to liberty and self-government. He was widely regarded at the time of the Revolution as a philosopher of the first order and one with special insights on logic, morality, and even childhood education, not to mention his famous articulations of natural rights, social compact theory, and the right to revolution. Despite all this, and notwithstanding scholarly debates about how to measure the historical reception of a thinker like Locke, assessing exactly how Locke served as a philosophical influence on the founding, as our panel this morning demands, is not an easy task for one simple reason. There are about as many interpretations of Locke as there are interpreters of Locke. Arguably, no thinker in the Western tradition generates more disagreement, and especially in political theory, few academic discussions become as emotionally charged, as commentators seem prone to reading their own aspirations and anxieties into Locke. Depending on who you read, Locke is an arch-liberal, and that's bad, an arch-liberal, and that's good, a deeply Christian thinker, and that's bad, a deeply Christian thinker, and that's good, not a Christian at all, which is good or bad. One scholar even says Locke is an intellectual predecessor to Bentham and Foucault, and that Locke's arguments for childhood education creates a panopticon-like environment that teaches children to internalize the gaze of the quasi-authoritarian father, and thus prepares those children for life in liberal society, and that's bad. Now, these disagreements make it hard enough to interpret Locke, but on top of that, many read their own Locke into the founding. So how to proceed? With my time today, I would like to offer a correction to one of the most prominent scholars to take a bad interpretation of Locke and then read it into the founding, namely Patrick Deneen of the University of Notre Dame. I don't have time to explain all the ways in which Deneen misunderstands the founders, but my hope is that in the process of correcting his interpretation of Locke, I can begin to uncover for you the Locke the founders read and who they reached for when seeking to justify and vindicate their natural rights. To summarize his presentation briefly, in his book, Why Liberalism Failed, there are two central elements to Deneen's critique of Locke and the founders. First, he says that Locke's philosophy unleashes human desires from the moorings of virtue and morality. In times past, liberty meant the freedom to pursue what was good. But for Locke, as Deneen argues, liberty is ideally the agent's ability to do whatever he likes, which demands the greatest possible pursuit and satisfaction of appetites. The second element of his critique is his argument that the purpose of law is not to restrain vice, but is meant to expand personal freedom. And for evidence, he quotes a passage from section 57 of Locke's second treatise. It goes like this: "The end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom." This is part of his broader argument that the aim of the institutions of modern liberal government are meant to deliver to the individual ever greater access to things that will tickle and feed him, which facilitates the individual's atomization and ensures his dependence upon the government, all the while allowing the government to arrogate more power to itself. I will argue that Deneen is wrong in both Locke's understanding of the nature of liberty. Casey is signaling, he is channeling us. I will argue that Deneen is wrong in both Locke's understanding of the nature of liberty and the purpose of law and government. To begin responding to his view, we need to revisit one of the passages that Deneen referenced, that the end of law is to preserve and enlarge freedom, because there is a section that immediately precedes Deneen's quotation that gives this passage a much different sense. This is Locke from section 57. Quote, "For law in its true notion is not so much the limitation as the direction of a free and intelligent agent to his proper interests, and prescribes no farther than is for the general good of those under that law. Could they be happier without it? The law, as a useless thing, would of itself vanish, and that ill deserves the name of confinement, which hedges us in only from bogs and precipices. So let's unpack this a little bit. First, he says that the purpose of law is to direct men to their true and proper interests, and suggests that without that direction, their happiness is at stake. Put another way, if they have interests that are true and proper, which lead to happiness, it must mean that some interests are false, which, if chosen, would result in misery. Second, what about this business of hedging us in from bogs and precipices? At the time, this metaphor signifies something like guardrails against moral pitfalls. Thomas Hobbes, in the Latin version of his Leviathan, makes the same point in clearer language. This is Hobbes. For the end of laws is not to restrain people from a harmless liberty, but to prevent them from rushing into dangers or harms to themselves or to the commonwealth from impetuous passions, rashness, or foolishness, as roads are hedged, not as an obstacle to travelers, but to prevent them from wandering off with injury to their fellow citizens. So the law serves to curtail liberty to some degree because without guidance, individuals are likely to be blown about by their passions in a way that could harm them. There is such a thing as too much freedom. So we can see that for Locke, there is a moral component to the law, which serves to protect us from certain moral failings so that we can be truly free. Additionally, we should take note of the fact that Locke does not specify what kind of law he is talking about. And that is because, properly understood, all law shapes morality. In fact, Locke says that human law, or civil law, ought to promote the teachings of the natural law, which counsel moral behavior. In section 135 of the second treatise, Locke tells us that, quote, the obligations of the law of nature cease not in society, but only in many cases are drawn closer and have by human laws known penalties annexed to them to enforce their observation. Thus, the law of nature stands as an eternal rule to all men, end quote, which includes notably legislators. It is the responsibility of lawmakers to craft laws and policies that encourage adherence to the commands of the natural law. And as Locke says in various parts of the two treatises, these commands require that men respect the lives, families, and property of their neighbors. In fact, given the statement just quoted, I submit that one ought to read Locke's various statements regarding the conclusions of the natural law as policy proposals that the civil authority should seek to cultivate. For example, consider the following passage dealing with sex and marriage from the first treatise, the first part of the book. In section 59, which says that the sexual sins of, quote, adultery, incest, and sodomy cross the main intention of nature, which willeth the increase of mankind and the continuation of the species in the highest perfection, and the distinction of families, with the security of the marriage bed as necessary thereunto, end quote. If the natural law ought to inform civil law, then we should read this passage as a policy recommendation. And strikingly, Locke would seem to affirm this when in one of his toleration letters, he says that the magistrate must punish, quote, the dishonesty and debauchery of men's lives, end quote, and prohibit licentious sexual activities such as arbitrary divorce, polygamy, concubinage, and fornication. The reason for such restrictions is to continue the species by securing the marriage bed, meaning that the goal is to protect children who need the attention and care of their parents, which would be undermined by loose sexual practices and unstable marriages. In this respect, Locke agrees with Jefferson in his proposed revision to the Virginia Criminal Code that government would be defective in its principal purpose if it did not limit such immoral behavior. In fact, legislating morality was something Locke was very comfortable with in his own statesmanship. In the 1690s, while serving on the Board of Trade, Locke drafted a welfare proposal that aimed to encourage industriousness and punish laziness. Locke said that failure to enforce the laws on the books led to a ballooning of the beggar class, fraught with idleness, poverty, and villainy. The proposal suggested that the sources of this rise in viciousness was the relaxation of discipline, the corruption of manners, virtue and industry being as constant companions on the one side as vice and idleness are on the other. Accordingly, the first step to reforming the poor was to institute a restraint on debauchery by enforcing current laws and by the, quote, suppressing of superfluous brandy shops and unnecessary alehouses, end quote. The main thrust of the law is to disincentivize idle men from illegally begging, with the punishments varying based on the age, physical condition, or sex of the offender, and whether the offender simply neglects to find work, or if they were unable to find work that pays sufficiently well. For the serial beggars who will not seek out work, the most severe punishment is for men between the ages of 14 and 50, who are of sound limb and mind. If such men are found begging in the maritime counties, they are to be arrested and ultimately put on one of the king's ships. Once aboard, they would serve for at least 3 years under strict discipline at soldiers' pay and be punished as deserters, most likely with flogging, if they tried to escape or if they disobeyed the instructions of their superiors. Another provision in the law suggested that funds should be provided for the children of poor parents to attend working schools, where they could learn useful skills, develop a work ethic, and be obliged to attend church every Sunday. so that, quote, they may be brought into some sense of religion, whereas now they are utter strangers, both to religion and morality, end quote. It is worth noting that we do not have evidence that the founders knew of this proposal of Locke's. Nevertheless, I mention it because it is congruent with the founders' own policies. Jefferson's Poor Law is in many respects just a watered-down version of Locke's, and the founders also thought that it was appropriate for the state to make legal provision, as they did in the Northwest Ordinance, to encourage through education, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge, which are necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, end quote. So thus far, it seems that Locke has a more robust understanding of liberty and virtue than Deneen suggests. I'll now briefly address the argument that liberal institutions seek to atomize man. For Locke, the social compact is social. And hearkening back to some of the discussion from last night's panel, the point of the compact is to define a political community and to defend the group against outsiders. In other words, the social compact presupposes some differentiation of peoples prior to the formation of the compact. Locke puts it this way in the two treatises, quote, since those who liked one another so well as to join into society cannot but be supposed to have some acquaintance and friendship together, and some trust one in another, they could not but have greater apprehensions of others than of one another. And therefore their first care and thought cannot but be supposed to be how to secure themselves against foreign force, end quote. It is the affinity that a collection of people have for each other that is the precondition for their choosing to unite together and to establish government to promote their mutual security and future happiness. In this respect, Locke is in lockstep with the founders in his understanding of the social compact theory. For example, he would agree with the formulation of the theory set out in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 that says, quote, the body politic is formed by a voluntary association of individuals. It is a social compact by which the whole people covenants with each citizen, and each citizen with the whole people, that all shall be governed by certain laws for the common good, end quote. As I mentioned the common good, and I come to the end of my time, I want to leave you with one parting thought. In our time, it is very easy to be caught up in the social and political proclivities of the present and to let present realities shape our political horizons. I'll give you an example of what I mean. After a class I was teaching recently at Florida State, a colleague and I were talking with a student about government intrusion into our daily lives. The student responded by comedically throwing up her hands and saying, well, I don't have any money to my name, so what does it matter if my information is taken or if the government is constantly spying on me? In Federalist 57, Madison speaks of the, quote, vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the people of America, a spirit which nourishes freedom and in return is nourished by it. He then warns that if this spirit diminishes in the people, they will tolerate anything but liberty. For those of us who teach American civics, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration is an important time to remind students of the purpose of government, to promote their safety and happiness. Or, as the Massachusetts Constitution puts it, quote, to secure the existence of the body politic, to protect it, and to furnish the individuals who compose it with the power of enjoying in safety and tranquility their natural rights and the blessings of life, end quote. Locke has a great phrase for this. Salus populis suprema lex. The well-being of the people is the supreme law. Students need to be taught this valuable principle, and thus I encourage you to follow George Washington's counsel given in his first annual message when he suggested education as an area worthy of the Congress's deliberation. Knowledge is the surest basis of public happiness and the security of a free constitution in part, Washington says, because it teaches citizens to, quote, know and to value their own rights, end quote. Let's use the semi-quincentennial as an opportunity to remind students of those rights. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.